Hey everyone! Before we dive into today's chilling tales, if you're a fan of spooky stories and love a good scare, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. And if you're ready to feel the goosebumps, go ahead and give this video a like. It really helps support the channel and lets me know you want more. Now let's get into the horror. This happened in late August of 2019 on a stormy night. My wife Emma and I own a farm in rural Nebraska where we primarily grow soybeans. It's a peaceful, quiet life, one we've both known since we were kids. Farming is in our blood, and we've always loved it, even though it means being far away from a lot of people. Our closest neighbors, Dan and Sam, live about half a mile away in opposite directions. They're also farmers, and like us, don't get out much, so we've grown close over the years. We often host them and their families for dinners, and they do the same in return. On this particular night, we had Dan and his wife over for drinks. We spent the evening enjoying wine and playing board games, getting progressively drunker as the night went on. They left around 11 p.m., which, given how close their farm is, was an easy 30-second drive. Afterward, Emma and I decided to relax with some more wine and watch a movie. We were both pretty tipsy and starting to feel the effects of the alcohol, and we figured we'd probably just fall asleep on the couch. That's when we heard a knock at the door. At this hour, a knock was odd, nearly unheard of, especially out here in the middle of nowhere. I thought I heard a muffled voice too. I turned down the TV and waited, hoping it was just a mistake. About 20 seconds later, there was another knock followed by the voice again, clearer this time, saying, "We need help." My first instinct was to get up and answer the door, but Emma quickly grabbed my arm. She looked at me with concern and shook her head. She whispered, "Don't open it, just don't. They might not even know we're here." I hesitated for a moment, but the voice on the other side seemed insistent. I asked through the door, "Who is it?" The voice responded, "Oh, thank God. Can you open up? We're lost." I asked, "Who's we?" The voice replied, "My wife and I." I pushed further. "Can your wife say something?" There was silence for a beat, then the voice came back. "Yeah, but she's not next to me right now." That's when something didn't sit right with me. The voice didn't sound normal, like it was trying to sound a bit higher or more frantic. My gut was telling me something was wrong. I laughed nervously and asked, "Dan, is that you?" Dan had a habit of playing pranks when he was drunk, and I thought maybe it was him trying to mess with me. The voice on the other side dropped a little in pitch and said, "Yeah." For a second, I thought it was really him, and I almost felt relieved. But I still wasn't opening the door. Something was off, and I wasn't willing to take any chances. People didn't knock on your door out here, especially not at this time of night. I decided to press them. "Prove it. What's your wife's name?" The response chilled me to the bone. That's a trick question. I didn't laugh this time. My heart skipped a beat, and I told Emma I was calling Dan. She immediately suggested we call the police, but I didn't think we had time. I grabbed my phone and dialed Dan's number. It rang 3 times before he picked up, and I didn't waste time asking any pleasantries. "Dan, are you at my front door right now?" I asked, already feeling the tension. "No, why?" he replied. I told him there was someone out there trying to trick me into opening the door. Dan said he'd be right over, and we hung up quickly. Just as I hung up, more knocks came at the door, louder this time. I shouted, "I've got a shotgun waiting for you if you don't leave now." The voice on the other side responded, "We're just trying to use the phone. That's all we need." Emma, still on the phone with 911, was starting to panic. Out here, it could take an officer forever to get to us, and I knew the situation was escalating. We heard footsteps walking around our wooden deck, the kind that wraps around the house like someone was circling it. Then, we heard one of them trying to lift a window. The blinds were drawn, but we could hear the unmistakable sound of someone trying to pry it open. That was it. "Leave us alone!" Emma screamed, terrified. I yelled too, "Get the hell out of here, or I'll shoot you." I didn't waste time thinking. I ran upstairs to grab my shotgun from the closet. As I was halfway up the stairs, there were more pounding knocks at the door, and this time I heard Dan's voice yelling, "Open up!" I rushed to the door and let him in, still holding the shotgun. Dan had also brought his own. He told me he hadn't seen anything strange when he drove up, but when he got to our property, he stayed with us until the police arrived. The police didn't take long, but it felt like an eternity. After a quick sweep of the property, they didn't find anyone. Dan stayed with us for a little while longer, and the officer left us with advice to install security cameras at both the front and back of the house. It was something we hadn't considered until that night. Looking back, I still get chills thinking about it. The only thing keeping whoever was out there that night from getting inside was a wooden door. If it hadn't been for Dan's quick thinking, and the fact that we had the presence of mind to call the police, I don't know how that night would have ended. To this day, we've installed cameras, and we lock everything up like Fort Knox when the sun goes down. It's a different feeling, knowing how vulnerable we were. That door, and the people behind it, will stay with me forever. I'm renting a house in a quiet part of western Pennsylvania. It's a charming old place, built in 1927 by the Henson family, and it has been passed down through generations. My landlord, Margaret, lives a few acres away in her own home, which was constructed in the late 1970s. Margaret also owns the house next door, which she rents out to others. The entire property spans about 40 acres, most of which is used as farmland, growing wheat and barley. The house we live in is the original farmhouse that was once the heart of the Henson estate. My husband, Michael, our 2 kids, and our dog moved in this past March. It's a cozy 2-bedroom house with the kind of charm that comes from old buildings: wood paneling, shiplap walls in the hallway, and antique trim around the windows. The garage is the most modern addition, built of sturdy cinder blocks, but the rest of the house still carries that rustic, vintage feel. Margaret has shared many stories about the house's long history, and it's evident from the way she talks about it that she holds it near and dear. Her family has owned this land for nearly a century. At first, everything about the house seemed completely normal. The only small issue was the well water, which we had resolved quickly by installing a water softener. Once that was sorted, we were able to settle in comfortably. Everything was great, until one morning when things started to take a strange turn. I get up every day at 6 a.m. to get ready for school. After a rough stretch of job hunting, I decided to go back to school to pursue a degree in physical therapy. I had previously worked in early childhood education, but found it hard to find work in my field, so I decided to make a fresh start. On this particular morning, Michael, who is a police officer, had the day off. He let the kids sleep in with him, so I didn't need to rush them to the sitter's house in the dark. I was getting dressed in the living room to avoid waking up Michael or our son, who liked to sleep in our bed. That's when I noticed something odd. The door to our children's room was wide open, and standing just inside, partially hidden behind the doorframe, was someone watching me. The figure was taller than both of my kids, about a head taller, and had messy, dirty blonde curls. I froze, staring at the figure, unsure of what I was seeing. Slowly, the figure pulled its head back behind the doorframe and vanished. It all happened in a matter of seconds. For context, the room is small. My daughter's bed is pushed up against the wall with the foot of the bed near the doorframe, and both their twin-sized beds fit snugly in there with barely any extra space. So, seeing someone standing there felt completely out of place, especially since no one could possibly stand there and hide behind the doorframe at the same time. It just wasn't physically possible. Panicking, I ran straight to their room. My daughter was sound asleep at the top of her bed, and both kids were tucked in tight under the blankets. I checked the room thoroughly, but there was no sign of anyone else. I woke Michael up, and he could tell I was shaken. He said my pupils were huge, and I was trembling. I told him what I had seen, and he went to check the room himself. He came back, saying there was no one there, and that I probably imagined it. I started to wonder if maybe he was right. but I knew deep down what I had seen. That was 2 months ago, and I still can't shake the feeling. But what happened tonight made everything even more unsettling. Michael was brushing our daughter's hair after her bath when he saw a dark shadow dart across the doorway of their room. It happened so fast, but it was clear enough that he immediately called me over. When I entered the room, I could tell he was visibly shaken. His arms and legs had goosebumps, and even our 3-year-old noticed. She looked up at him and asked innocently, "Who's in there, Dad?" Her question made the moment feel even more eerie. Later that night, as we were getting the kids ready for bed, something even stranger happened. One of my daughter's toys, a small circus set, suddenly started going off by itself. It wasn't just a fluke. It happened multiple times, even though no one was near it. My husband called me from the bathroom to come see, and as I approached the toy, it went off again. For context, the toy circus only plays music when you move a little acrobat across a tightrope. You have to lift one side of the circus stand for it to work, and it doesn't just turn on by itself. No one had touched it, yet it was making noise as if someone was playing with it. That's when we decided we needed to take action. We're planning to install cameras in the kids' room and around the toy area this weekend to see if we can figure out what's going on. It's the only way we might catch something strange happening in real time. This house, built in 1927, is full of charm and history, but it also seems to have come with something unexpected. It's definitely more than what we signed up for in the rental agreement, and I'm starting to wonder just how much of the house's history is still lingering in the walls. Whatever, or whoever, is in this house, it doesn't seem like it's ready to leave anytime soon. My girlfriend, Sarah, and I had been living together for several years before we made the decision to move to a new house about 2 years ago. The house is located in a peaceful, rural area in the outskirts of a small town in North Wales, sitting on a quiet dead-end road. The property is massive, stretching across at least 250 acres of farmland, with open fields and dense woodland at the end of the street. We were excited about the move and looked forward to the peace and quiet of rural life. We met most of the locals quickly, and they were all friendly. About 3 months after we moved in, Sarah made a pretty big decision on her own without consulting me. She adopted a 9-month-old dog from the local shelter. The dog, a golden retriever, was sweet but completely untrained. Thankfully, we had a large backyard, and most of the neighbors had dogs, so they understood the challenges we were facing with her barking and other puppy behavior. The dog was a handful, but we were patient, especially since she was still adjusting to her new home. Everything was going smoothly until one morning, about a week after we brought her home. I returned from an early shift at work to find that the dog had escaped from the yard. I immediately called Sarah to let her know, and she said she would be home soon. Meanwhile, I started walking around the neighborhood to ask if anyone had seen her. To my relief, a few of the locals had seen her, but unfortunately, the last sighting was of the dog heading toward the large farmland at the end of the street. I walked down to the end of the road, hoping to find her, but there was a giant, rusted fence blocking the way, with a sign that read, "No trespassing, violators will be shot." Naturally, I was concerned, but decided not to cross the fence and risk getting in trouble. Just then, Sarah arrived at the end of the road and told me that she'd managed to find out who owned the farmland. She had gotten the owner's number from a neighbor, so we called him. The man, who sounded a bit rough, told us to meet him in front of his house, which was right next to the property. When we got there, we saw that the place was in terrible condition. The fence was falling apart, and the bushes had overtaken the front yard. As we approached the house, I looked through the window and froze. There were mannequins everywhere. They were dressed in various pieces of lingerie, and they were all covered in what looked like dried red paint, but I couldn't be sure. I glanced at Sarah, and we both shared an uncomfortable look. Before we could process what we were seeing, the man appeared out of nowhere. He was a middle-aged, sunburned, rough-looking guy with a gruff attitude. He immediately shouted that he had seen our dog and that we should follow him so he could show us where she was. I wasn't keen on following this stranger, but based on what some of the neighbors had told us, this guy had a reputation for being hot-headed. He had been known to shoot people's dogs in the past, so we felt it would be best not to anger him. As we followed him, he started making small talk with Sarah, asking her how old she was and how long we had been living in the house. The questions began to get more personal, and I could tell Sarah was starting to feel uncomfortable. Fortunately, just as things were starting to feel creepier, our dog appeared, wagging her tail. We grabbed her quickly, thanked the man, and pretty much bolted out of there. We decided to fix up our fence immediately and put the weird incident behind us. However, a few days later, things started to take a darker turn. I work early mornings, usually starting at 3:30 or 4 a.m., and one morning, I got up as usual, got dressed, and left for work. When I drove out of the carport, I noticed something odd, a white car idling on the road outside of our house. Now this is a very quiet area, and I knew that no one in the neighborhood would be up at that hour, so it stood out to me. I turned on my high beams, and to my surprise, it was the same guy from the farm. As soon as he saw my headlights, he drove off quickly. I immediately called work to let them know I wouldn't be coming in, and instead, I parked my car out front and stayed up all night, keeping an eye on the road to make sure he didn't come back. The next morning, the same thing happened, same white car, same time. He idled outside, and as soon as I turned on my headlights, he sped off again. I didn't know what to make of it, but it felt too odd to ignore. The same scenario played out for 2 more mornings, until Monday when I had enough. I locked up the house, got in my car, and drove toward him, hitting my high beams and blaring the horn. He drove off, but this time, I had enough of his nonsense. I followed him for a short while until he noticed and sped up, driving 50 miles per hour on our long, bumpy road. I got his license plate number before he lost me. Then I called the police and passed on all the details. The officers told me to go home and assured me they'd send someone right away. I went inside, woke Sarah up, and told her what had happened. She was freaked out, and just as I finished explaining, 4 squad cars pulled up outside our house. 2 of them drove down the road and parked near the farm, while 1 officer came inside to check on us and make sure we were okay. The officers stayed with us until morning, and later that day, they informed us they had caught the guy speeding down the highway. They searched his car and found 2 knives, a pistol, a rifle, and several photos of Sarah, along with a pair of her underwear. Naturally, we were absolutely terrified. We immediately filed a restraining order, and we were told he would be held until his trial. It was a wake-up call for me. Looking back, I realize I should have called the police much sooner, but I didn't think anything this serious would happen. It's something I'll never forget, and I've certainly learned my lesson about trusting my gut and taking action sooner.